Alright, here we go. Now that we have a firm understanding of Africa and West African culture, let's see what happens when the Europeans show up. Alright, slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was a result of European expansion of power, starting in the 1400s and continuing all the way into the 1900s in some areas. European nations were trying to explore, conquer, and colonize in Africa, Asia, and in the Americas, but Portugal definitely took the lead when it comes to Africa. During the 1400s, its ships started to reach Africa's western coast, and you can kind of see this pattern here along this map as it's as early as 1415, they're expanding, or even earlier in some cases. And right around when Columbus is over on the other side of the ocean, they're starting to really get on the other side of Africa and completely engulf it. The Portuguese captains early on, they had the goal of finding Christian allies against the Muslims and Berbers of North Africa, but also to spread Christianity. So there was a religious and military purpose early on. But trade, once they realized the strength and possibilities of trade with West Africa, that became the top goal instead. The larger goal of trade with Asia inspired a search for a lot of new ways to get to Asia. And so the Spanish would finance Christopher Columbus's westward voyages in 1492. Now, Columbus never thought the world was flat. Nobody thought the world was flat. Nobody believes that. He did, however, believe that the world was much smaller than it actually is, and he hoped to reach Asia by just sailing west. And so he figured he'd just sail west from Europe, and eventually, right around here, where North America is, he would hit Japan and India and China. And the world is much bigger than he thought, not flat. His mistake led to the conquest, settlement, and really exploitation of the Americas for resources. Columbus landed in the Caribbean islands, and he quickly enslaved. That's one of the first things he did in his first trip. He enslaved the indigenous population for use in the gold mines and in the fields to produce whatever crops he needed. But native slavery really didn't work out. In most cases, they died off of disease at a rate of about 90%. Overwork, and then many were literally worked to death in the mines especially, or they escaped because they had a stronger knowledge of the terrain, so they knew where to run to, where to hide. And so just native slavery wasn't going to work out. And so after a while, the European colonists started to turn to the African slave trade instead for labor. Slave labor was already common in West Africa, so it would have been a natural transition from native slavery to West African slavery. Portuguese explorers, once they arrived, they found a thriving slave trade already happening in Senegambia, Benin, and Congo. This was already happening. These kingdoms were involved with a trade with Islamic nations, so they were trading with Islamic nations up here and also over here. That all involved the sale of Europeans, the sale of North African Berbers, but as well as sub-Saharan Africans. So this early version of slavery was not based on race. It was moving all over, and so the black lines in this case show some of the main slave trade routes in the medieval age. And so we've already got slaves from and to Europe, from and to across North Africa, even into India. And so there's already a massive trade network of slaves. The slave trade within West Africa was through Sudanese horsemen, these guys that were just experts on using horses to invade and quickly capture slaves in the forest region stateless villages. Women and children were mostly captured to serve as concubines and servants in North Africa. So concubine, like a female servant in North Africa and Southwest Asia. Men, less likely to be captured, but they were used to serve in the North African armies, so they kind of used to serve their purpose. Demand for slaves in Muslim countries remained high, as many died from disease or were later on freed and would just assimilate and become part of Arab society. So they required more slaves as they needed constant renewal. Demand for slaves rivaled gold in producing wealth for West African societies like Timbuktu, Walata, Jenne, and Gao. It was not until around 1600 that the Atlantic slave trade became as large as the trans-Saharan slave trade. So this trade within Africa was very strong. And the first Portuguese captains arrived off the Guinea coast, and they traded for gold, ivory, pepper, and then slaves as early as the 1400s. And early on, 1441, we have the first case of Portuguese slavery, where West Africans were captured and sent to serve as servants to a Portuguese prince. And for decades, Portuguese raiders would just hit along the coast, take West Africans to use as domestic servants in Portugal and in Spain. 1472, we see another shift, where a Portuguese merchant, Rua de Soqueira, signs a deal with the king of Benin to trade for gold, ivory, and slaves. So before it was just raids. Now this is an official trade with real documents, and it's really going to expand the trade too. Europeans were restricted by African kingdoms to a few trading points along the coast, and while the African kingdoms raided the interior for slaves. So early on, it was a couple raids by the Portuguese. Now it's a deal with African kings that the African kings will do the work of capturing the actual slaves. So here's an example of the Manin Congo giving audience to his subjects and Portuguese visitors. So it's kind of the Portuguese showing up asking to break into this trade. In the 1500s, inter-ethnic rivalries led to warfare to produce more slaves, as these different kingdoms wanted to get in on this business to sell and make money and get new weapons from the Europeans. There was no concept of racial solidarity that really existed to slow Africans selling to Europeans. There was no racial harmony there. They didn't really understand the idea of one Africa. They were different tribes, different peoples, the same way that Europe has different peoples and different rivalries within Europe. It's not until the 1700s that the victims of the trade start to really see the effects, and they start to call for racial solidarity to prevent the trade, but it's already had a massive impact by that point. Before Columbus, the trade was limited to supplying a small amount of servants to Portugal and Spain, but there really wasn't a huge demand for servants and slaves in Europe. They already had a large workforce. They had plenty of poor people to use as servants. They didn't need slaves. It was just an extra luxury. Then America showed up and everything changed. The European colonies in the Americas drastically increased that demand for African slaves because there wasn't a reliable, easy workforce to use in the Americas already. The Native American Indian labor force, that just wasn't working out. They were dying or running away. And so African slaves were used to kind of replace as the new workforce. And by 1502, we started to see this transition from native to African slavery in the Americas, first being used in the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, we'll talk about later. The gold and silver mines, like in Potosi in Mexico, used African slaves. In Brazil, we started to see massive sugar plantations producing an enormous demand for slaves from Africa. And once sugar was nothing new, but because of these massive plantations in the Americas, this allowed for an expansion of sugar in Europe, and it became really profitable. Sugar was big money. Desserts became big money and much more popular in Europe. And it's because an increase of demand for sugar, this resulted in an increase of demand for slaves to make that money. And so we started to get huge sugar plantations in Brazil and in the Caribbean islands, making a lot of money. Later on, the cultivation of tobacco, rice, and indigo for the British in North America increased demand for slaves there because sugar just wasn't growing as well in that region. But tobacco, rice, and indigo, that's big money, and that allows the growth of North America. By 1510, Spain is in on the game too. They joined Portugal in the slave trade to create a new, harsher form of slavery, different than what we saw in the old world, where there were certain rules and they were treated differently. This slavery is going to be based purely on race, and most slaves were men to be used as agricultural laborers, not as soldiers or servants the way they were in Africa. Europeans, they figured men are going to be stronger laborers, and they figured they're going to be better farmers, even though West Africans used women for most of the farming, and they tended to keep them for that purpose. So the West Africans knew that women were better farmers, so they would keep them, and they'd sell off the men because they knew the men wouldn't be farmers even though most of these men were going off to plantations. And so the West Africans knew a little bit more about West African culture and history than the Europeans did. The enslaved became chattel slavery. Chattel, it's from the root word for cattle, so they're treated as animals, cows, work beasts. And so they're serving as personal property, and they lose their customary rights as human beings. They're served as chattel, as something lesser. Portugal and Spain really dominated the trade in the early part of it. In the 1500s, they're dominating the trade, shipping 2,000 people a year to the colonies, mostly to Brazil for the sugar. 6.5 of the total 11.3 million slaves in the entire history of the slave trade go to Portugal and Spanish colonies. The vast majority will go to Latin America. Both monarchies would grant monopolies of the trade to private companies. So this is just a couple companies really dominating the trade. And 1518 in Spain, we start to see a monopoly, and this becomes known as the asiento, or contract, where one company gets to have complete control over the slave trade, over the ships and the lanes to get there. By 1550, the Dutch, the French, and the English also start to want to get into this business with big money. And so during the 1600s, the Dutch drive out the Portuguese because the Dutch have better, stronger, faster ships, better guns, and the Portuguese start to weaken. And so they kick them out of West Africa to become the top slave trading nation. So the Dutch don't really settle too much, but they do make a lot of money. And so here's an example of one of their colonies where they made a lot of money, New Amsterdam, modern day New York. And so a picture of New York where they've got traders, but also in the background, slaves. The Dutch started to first shift sugar production to the West Indies or the Caribbean, and then other Europeans followed along. So England started to expand sugar into Barbados and Jamaica. France starts to expand into Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti later on, Guadeloupe and Martinique. By 1620, tobacco becomes the major cash crop in Virginia and Maryland, and they start to increase the demand for slaves up there for the purpose of tobacco. England, France, and the Dutch, they're all competing against each other for control of this slave trade, this big money. 1674, England kicks out the Dutch, and they're knocked out of the trade, so New Amsterdam becomes New York when the English start to dominate and kick them out. 1713, England defeats France and Spain to completely control the asiento, to control the complete slave trade, to supply slaves to all of Spain's American colonies. They go through British ships. After 1730, England ships about 20,000 slaves per year, and at their peak, England is shipping about 50,000 slaves per year. As far as the economics and how it works, we'll go into detail on this. The profits of the slave trade, along with sugar and tobacco profits from slavery, were invested right back into England. So England's going to use all this money from the slave trade, which is significant, to fuel change. And so this allows them to be the first nation to have their industrial revolution, where they move into machinery and more advanced labor, and moving away from farms to factories. And so Africa becomes a market for all these cheap English manufactured goods that they're making. As they go from handmade cloth to machine-made cloth, they're able to produce a whole lot of it to sell to Africa. We get two different trade systems developing in the triangular trade network. Under the English system, the English make really cheap goods, so cloth and metal goods, and then they're going to ship these to Africa for slaves. And so they'll trade the cloth, rum, anything that they can make for slaves. The slaves are then brought over to the West Indies. West Indies is kind of the major trade point where they're stopped there, and they may be shipped off to Latin America or to the Americas. And then within the West Indies, they're going to make a whole bunch of sugar, which will go back to England. That sugar will be processed into rum, and that little English triangle continues. We also got a bit of an American triangle, where the New England colonists would bring, and so they would get sugar from the West Indies to places like Boston. Boston would create rum. Rum would then be brought over to Africa to be exchanged for slaves. And the molasses would be to New England to kind of keep this process going. And so we've got this a molasses network into rum, into slaves, all back and forth. And it's making a whole lot of money for the Americans and for the Europeans. And so that was a little look at this transition period as Europeans and Americans started to enter and work with and work against the Africans.